Hey everybody, it's the Mad Master, also known as Mad Warrior here. And I've been planning this video for a long time, at least since early spring. And this one might rile a few feathers, but I don't really care. This one is about the historically chastised and hated lawn gnome himself, the extraordinary drummer, Lars Ulrich. So, this video I am entitling in defense of Lars Ulrich. And I am not excusing by any means some of his more douchey stuff over the years. I mean, let's face it, like, the Napster stuff, I think he mishandled that situation very badly, and even he kind of admits begrudgingly that he was somewhat wrong in how he handled it, which I would obviously agree with, that he did mishandle that. Now, in regard to a lot of what people have said about Lars over the years, I think people don't have a very nuanced opinion. Take, for example, this t-shirt that I've seen making the rounds. It should have been Lars, which is just a horrific joke to me as far as like Lars Ulrich and just like people dying, because Cliff Burton died. Oh, it shouldn't have been Lars instead. That's really messed up and really morbid and really insensitive. I'm sure Cliff Burton's dad would not appreciate that, for example. Now, I'm going to go into some of the reasons why I think that people are so aghast at Lars, but I'm also going to go into some things that I think are unfair and just kind of like something that is just not really right with bashing him. So, and I think he's misunderstood. That's another thing. So, now let's begin with the drums. So, in recent years, he's definitely gotten a lot lazier, by his own admission, actually. He's actually humble enough in a certain way to say that he doesn't practice enough and he's not the greatest drummer nowadays. Now, other musicians would just say they're the best and, they don't have anything wrong. But he'll admit to it. He'll cop to it. Now, I think people conflate his current performances with some of the stuff he's done in the 80s, and I think that's really misguided. I would say Metallica, their sound is in part based on Lars Ulrich, because the way that the riffs James Hetfield writes and plays and how they're synchronized with a lot of it Lars's drumming, it wouldn't sound the same. I would dare say, like, Dave Lombardo is a far superior drummer technically, obviously. But would Lombardo play the same types of fills or the same type of things that Lars does if he were playing under James Hetfield? It would sound a lot different. Same with Charlie Benante or any of the great drummers of the Big Four or the drummers of the German thrash bands too, to say the least. So, in essence, with his 80s performances, I don't feel that it's a fair assessment to say he was a bad drummer. At the time, at least. I would say he was more middle of the road, average to above average, depending on the album and the tour and everything. So, I think one of the things I notice is that in the 80s, his performances really fed into the frenetic energy of Metallica in general. If you watch some of just the crazy, no doubt there was some drugs involved with this, revved up performances like Ride the Lightning, the tour for Ride the Lightning, or Master of Puppets. It's just there's an intensity to it that was not captured later as much. So that really helped Metallica. I mean, in a general, the stories about their early days with regards to like how they were just sped up and got more intense, I mean, a lot of that is because of Lars. So they would play these new wave of British heavy metal covers and then play them like at least 1.5 times the speed, if not twice the speed, probably at times. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is just how much like innovation he brought to the thrash genre in general, even on the very controversial album Injustice for All. I know people have criticized the Justice drums as fake because for some reason they think in 1988 you would be able to splice so many takes together in such a way that it's almost like using Pro Tools. I don't buy that per se. I think he probably obviously had a hard time recapturing some of those performances. Like Dyer's Eve was an infamous example that they hadn't played for many years because the performance was just so well done on the album. But I think he did his best on that album, and that really is his magnum opus as far as drumming. And I also will say that a certain other album that I will be talking about in the near future, hopefully, if I have time, I'm trying to get more time to do these videos, I will explain my defense of that album and the said drumming on that album. And you could probably guess what album that is, but because, anyways, not Lulu, though. Anyways, so the drumming, to me, for Lars, is one of those things that it's catchy. You know, you listen to the drums, it's a style that he has. He should have kept up with it and gotten better, you know. He should have maybe tried to polish his drumming in the 90s, but he got lazy, like a lot of musicians do. Like a certain lead guitarist in Metallica got kind of too, even though he was taking lessons for Joe Satriani for years and stuff. So, another thing about Lars is that I think the direction of the 80s Metallica albums, as far as thematic content, even if he didn't write the lyrics, I think he had an influence on that. I think James Hetfield writing these lyrics, you know, I would say somewhat political, considering the time people consider them political. It was before James got into the really heavy-handed personal lyrics later. I think Lars had an influence on that. And another thing that he had an influence on is the direction of the band in general and just like having a say in the arrangement part. You watch these videos of the making of Hardwired and Death Magnetic, and he's basically like de facto producer of these albums. For better or worse, of course, a lot of the mixing and mastering is on that's a whole other subject, and that's another thing to criticize Lars accepting some of these horrific mixes on some of the albums. But obviously he's had a role in the producer's chair with, telling Kirk, play this more like this, or probably even James telling him to do stuff. It was, it really influenced their direction. I'm sure early on that he had that kind of role, that kind of voice. So people really can't bash the first four Metallica. It's kind of like the holy grail of metal, along with like the first 7 Iron Maiden albums or Judas Priest early albums and stuff. So when people bash Lars, they are bashing Metallica in a certain way, even the 80s stuff by default in that way. Now, there are excesses that Lars pushed the band and partake in, because James Hetfield was kind of a passive person in some ways during Metallica's reign. So Lars kind of pushed the production of Justice, and Justice for All, that is, the album, to be what it was. And, that's problematic in many ways because of the lack of bass and the emphasis on this upper mids kind of muffled sound. I love the album because I grew up with it, but I understand the criticisms, and I think they should have released a mix more appropriate, with more appropriate sound more recently. So that's another thing. Now, conversely, though, we can take a look at Injustice for All and see how it influenced so many productions that came, that year and later, and even in the death metal genre. There's no doubt that, like, the Scott Burns, Morris sound, death metal, early death metal sound kind of had this kind of thing that was very much like a Justice for All. Like, listen to like some of the early albums by Deicide or Napalm Death or something like that. I mean, early death metal period, Napalm Death. Like Harmony Corruption, it kind of reminds you of Justice for All. And some of the albums by thrash bands like Heathen, just bands like that. They had, Justice for All was a very influential album, even for all its flaws production-wise, with arrangements, with bands wanting to be more quote-unquote progressive on their albums, like Anthrax's, what is it called, Persistence of Time. There's a lot of albums that came out that were very influenced by Justice for All. So Lars had a lot to do with that. Now, obviously, his production choices have been stupid or misguided in the least, and that's, lowering Jason Newsted's bass on Justice, letting the retail release of Death Magnetic clip at such a high level that it was hard to listen to and stand. Now, I would probably say Lars is also the guy that didn't recommend, but wanted Bob Rock to produce their album. Now, that brings me to another thing about Lars Ulrich that is a controversy that I've known since the 80s, because I've been reading music magazines for that long as a little kid and up. So Lars has always had his eye on mainstream bands to some extent. I wouldn't call him a hipster, because hipster means you like indie bands and stuff that are popular, not actual like mainstream bands. But he had his eyes on, he listened to, for example, I remember him listing his favorite albums for a year. One of them was Blue Murder, which is John Sykes' band after Whitesnake. I mean, you can't get any more mainstream than Whitesnake. Of course, I love Whitesnake at this age, and John Sykes as a guitarist. So I also remember him liking Europe's Final Countdown album, or maybe it was the one after that. So he's always had these mainstream but somewhat eclectic tastes. Another part of that, though, just reading all these interviews through the years of him, is that he likes to troll the metal community on purpose. I'll give you an example. I think, so there was this 1993 or maybe 95 interview with Lars in Rolling Stone. And there was this thing that I always quote to make fun of Lars Ulrich, or I have, that he'd been soaking up, quote unquote, soaking up records by Alanis Morissette and Oasis, and not listening to much metal, of course. He wasn't listening to any metal albums. Listing any metal albums. So to me, that was like, oh, he's just trying to like piss off the metal community with that. And I think there's probably some truth to that. He does it on purpose. And he's even said in interviews where he likes to make the metal community mad because they're closed-minded and all this stuff. Like, I think he has some disdain for the everyman metal fan, which is understandable to some extent. And I'm going to go into why in a second here, but it's kind of a complicated thing to talk about Lars in this way, because I think like in Some Kind of Monster, he talks about the machismo of people like Dave Mustaine and the metalheads, and like Lars is very educated European immigrant. He's a very educated European immigrant from Denmark. And they have a different way of doing things over there. So he comes to America, and things honestly probably seem a little more primitive to him. He's a metal fan, right? He's into Deep Purple, Motorhead. He's, loves Diamond Head. He plays tennis and all that, Comes to America and just sees these people just like, dude, So I think, in part, growing up how he did with his father was a big kind of affluent hippie tennis player guy. He comes over here and people are he has to talk down to some of these people. Just imagine, just take this, into consideration. He has to explain all this stuff to him sometimes about how things work in Europe or how his life was, and just these different concepts. It's pretentious, okay? I know he's pretentious, okay? But he has to do this because he's coming from this point of view, this upbringing that's completely different than someone like James Hetfield's. So it's this dynamic that he has to follow. So that makes him a little bit more cynical of the average metal fan in the 80s, especially when it was really working class and to be frank, way less educated than probably it is even now. So he had to deal with that, and he, obviously did, and it made him a little bit more like, I'm going to make fun of metalheads, especially later on after the 80s. And, he was jumping on the bandwagon. Metallica were in no doubts jumping on the bandwagon. But it resulted in him using Serrano's blood and semen artwork for Load and Reload. That was definitely his idea. His idea of French kissing, Kirk Hammett, his idea of wearing those clothes. I have no doubt that Lars really influenced those concepts in 90s Metallica. For better or worse. Of course, I don't like those albums that much musically. I don't think it sounds like Metallica. I just don't like the songs. But that imagery was definitely Lars' idea. Now, there's a very controversial thing that I disagree with Lars about nowadays, but he would probably fess up to it if questioned about it. He says Metallica aren't about politics, blah, blah, blah. So I take kind of offense to that because Injustice for All, no doubt, it was socio-political at least, if not outright political. Songs like Eye of the Beholder, Injustice for All, Ride the Lightning's about the death penalty. That's off Ride the Lightning, the album. So that's not true that they were never political. Now, I think James Hetfield has gone more to the right wing, but Lars doesn't talk about politics with James, and him and Kirk and Rob Trujillo are probably on the same level politically. Now, it was kind of a trend to have anti-establishment, ostensibly left-wing politics in thrash music in the 80s, and Metallica were definitely in the middle of that. But I think Lars influenced that one way or the other, his presence being there. So that's another thing about Metallica, because that's kind of, I identified with that as a kid because I kind of grew up in that, and I kind of bought into all that. So another thing that Lars Ulrich that I definitely like about him is that, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but I'm going to go back to some of his musical tastes in a minute, is that there's another Rolling Stone interview I read where he was asked about politics, and he's like, America, he does not understand because we just have two parties. In Denmark, they have 17 parties. He just doesn't get like how we can be so limited in scope. And that interview really influenced my own politics. So I can point to this like early to mid 90s interview. I don't think it was the same one where he said it was soaking up Alanis Morissette and Oasis, but still, it was like I started to think about Europe and what's going on there. It made me curious, you know. So I have him to thank for that more, you know, pluralistic view on politics that I have, or maybe left-wing, whatever you want to call it. Because that interview made me think about that stuff. It was really intelligently done. So back to his musical taste. So early on, he was into metal. You know, Cliff Burton came in the band and kind of widened their scope. They got into all sorts of stuff. You know, Metallica was always eclectic. I mean, they play a Killing Joke cover on Garage Days, you know. They have always had a variety of influences. Now, Lars, yeah, like I said before, I think he seems to likes to push buttons. So he talks about, oh, I know metalheads would never like this, blah, blah, blah. So he mentions these bands that they wouldn't like or whatever. You know, sometimes I think in the 80s, he even went all into I think he mentioned hair metal on purpose. You know, he mentioned Europe or Blue Murder. He probably liked those albums, obviously, and they are good albums. But I think he was trying to push buttons a little bit. I think that's the same thing with Alanis Morissette and Oasis. He says Oasis is one of his favorite bands, but whatever, you know. He likes to be a little controversial. He likes to push buttons. And, you know, that is his flaw, but it's also, like, been Metallica's... It's helped Metallica along because it's like he wanted to push buttons, he wanted to push boundaries. But sometimes that gets him in trouble. That's the way I see Lars Ulrich. So, you know, the production of Justice for All or Death Magnetic, the Napster thing, you know, alienating fans, that's Lars almost like making this rationalization in his head about, well, I'm pushing buttons, I'm pushing the status quo, even though Napster was definitely against the status quo. He's making these rationalizations in his head on the fly about all this stuff, and that's how he thinks. So I respect it because he is definitely a trailblazer as far as the business side of Metallica. He's always been a big part of that too. So he was the one, you know, he was one of the people that pushed that independent spirit that Metallica had, where they would let people tape their shows, where they were kind of do-it-yourself, didn't want to do a music video for many years, thought it was lame, you know, became kind of the people's band, at least for a while. So now they're a corporate behemoth, but that happens to a lot of bands and a lot of people, unfortunately. They forget their roots. But still, I think his spirit of pushing the boundaries kind of got adapted to his more status quo lifestyle. And that's what resulted in the Napster debacle in many ways. So that's what I have to say about that. I respect Lars Ulrich. I'd probably get along with him. I watch his Amoeba Records has these videos on YouTube, What's in My Bag. And he talked about what's in his bag, like when he went, they do this to promote this record store. I don't know, I think it's in LA. I watched it and I thought it was really cool. He seemed like a guy, I would hang out with him. I think he seems like a fun guy to talk to. I talked to him about a lot of stuff for hours, I could tell. You know, it was pretentious, him selling all that art and some kind of monster. You know, you could say, oh, he's this rich guy. But, you know, it's like, he's into art, okay? He's not buying, like, yachts. He's into art. He thinks, at least on some level, he considers himself an artist, okay? So I think that's respectable. I don't think it's like Metallica sold out and, like, they're just a corporation. That's it. It's not some binary like that. So in a way that, you know, this stuff has taken a long time for me because I used to be like any metalhead that bashed Lars Ulrich. But I've really thought this stuff out, and I really think that people need to attack him when people can attack him for the rightful things, but I think they're unfair. I think trying to understand from his point of view, trying to empathize with some of his stuff. And, I think it's fine attacking the Napster thing. And I think it's fine attacking Death Magnetics production, what happened to Jason Newsted on Justice for All, and during that period. It's fine. But I think people take it a little too far and think that Lars Ulrich is just this evil troll, even if he does, or evil lawn gnome, whatever you want to call it, evil gnome, metal gnome. But I don't think he is. I think he seems like a pretty decent human being in a lot of ways. And he's, he is the American dream. And you could say, oh, he's a leftist liberal too. Well, yeah, that's fine. People can have different political ideologies and still be example of the American dream. He came from privilege, and now he's in privilege again. But he worked really hard. He really pushed Metallica to be. If it isn't Iron Maiden, Metallica is the biggest metal band on earth. So I think that kind of concludes this video. I think I'm not trying to defend the indefensible people, but I think people just get it wrong about him a lot of the time, and it just goes a little too far for me. Just like that shirt, with Cliff Burton, it should have been Lars instead of Cliff. It's just juvenile and stupid. But anyways, I'm going to be doing more of these indefensive videos because these are really fun. I really like doing these. Please subscribe, share this video, and I will see you later.